Today, I want to talk about the issues of different formats. What's the pros and cons? Plus, how the size of the sensor could affect our photos and videos. Nowadays, there are 4 main formats. From big to small, they are medium format, full-framed, APS-C, and the 4/3. The 4/3 is the main from Olympus and Panasonic, and since they no longer produce DSLR, so the 4/3 format for mirrorless is the M4/3. Can we say that a bigger format is really much better in terms of all aspects, or the only advantage of a smaller format is just compact and convenient? When we shot with films in the past concerning still photos, of course, there were many different formats. For example, the 120, 6x6 or the 645. Most of those different formats are mainly for bigger sizes, which is the medium format. The mainstream would be the 135. By the way, a half-frame format was evolved from this full-frame format by splitting the frames when exposed. Regarding motion pictures, the biggest format, of course, is the IMAX. And there were 65mm, 35mm. There were also tiny size films, which were 16mm and 8mm. The 35mm is exactly the same size as the half-frame format of the 135 full-frame, and also the size of the APS-C. When it comes to the digital era, basically, we can say that the digital sensor can be cut into any size, and smaller size sensor could have resulted in a more complete system, and also with a cheaper price. Thus, different sizes of sensor could bring in different grades of products. And so, thus this really means a bigger size sensor is a better camera with a better image quality. So, let's now talk about what is image quality first. We always judge the goodness of a camera with image quality. But since it is a term with vagueness meaning, actually, what is this? And are there any conditions for judging it? We can judge the image quality firstly by its dynamic range and color science. Talking about dynamic range, it should be the more the better. But most of the time, people will accept a narrow dynamic range and just see it as an alternative style, or the so-called high contrast image. Same as the color performance. People seems will not mind colors that are a bit off from reality, and again, just seeing it as a style. Frankly speaking, these 2 conditions are no longer important for judging the image quality. Then, what's being left? The easiest found would be the details and clarity of the image. Concerning this, will comes to the conditions of image resolution, and of course, the more the better. It then comes to the feeling of 3 dimension. Here, the image resolution can again affect the 3-dimensional feeling. Actually, a lens could have affected the clarity and of course the 3-dimensional feeling. But put aside the factors of lenses, there is another factor that could affect the 3-dimensional feeling, and that is the control of depth of field. For sure that certain subjects could be more outstanding through a shallow depth of field. Since both the clarity and 3-dimensional feeling are the most important factor in judging the image quality, then we can come to an answer that which format could have better control over these 2 issues, the format for sure gets a better image quality. There are still 2 issues for judging the image quality. The first one is always neglected by people, and that is the high light roll-off. That means if there is a very smooth transition in the overexposed area without harsh steps. The benchmark movie camera, the RE Alexa, always proud of its performance regarding high roll-off, and so it is really important for the image quality. Highlight roll-off is well affected by the distribution of dynamic range. For example, if there are only 3 stops in the highlight area when the film is dynamic range, the highlight roll-off will then be quite harsh. But since not all the times their photo could have demonstrated an extreme highlight area, so this factor is rarely mentioned by people. And by the way, highlight roll-off could also be affected by the encoding bit rate. For sure, a 14-bit photo must be better than a 10-bit image. Thus, bit rate is also important for an image quality. The final factor is noise performance. All images will be the same good at low ISO regarding noise appearance, but how about at high ISO? Will the noise worsen the image quality? Sure, it will be nicer if a camera can be afforded with high ISO shooting. Here I can come to a brief conclusion that the image resolution and the three-dimensional feeling will have the biggest emotional impact on image quality. And without question that the big sensors or big formats will have a significant advantage with these 2 factors. Let me further explain. Firstly, suppose the pixel size is the same. A larger sensor, of course, can contain more pixels. For example, if a full-frame sensor can get 2,400 pixels, with the same size pixels, an APS-C is reduced to 1,200, while the M4 third can get 600 only. But on the other hand, you will also find that smaller sensor can also get a very high resolution. For example, even a mobile phone is equipping a 40 megapixel or 80 megapixel camera. However, back to the physical limitation. If a tiny sensor can contain the same amount of pixels of a larger sensor, the size of each pixel must be well smaller. Then what is the consequence? For sure, the larger the pixel, the better the light sensitivity. And it will directly affect the image quality when it comes to low light or high ISO photography. That's also why, till these 2 to 3 years, that the M4 third finally got 20 megapixel of resolution, as it has stayed with 16 megapixel for a long time. Finally, I will say that extremely high resolution will get you more detailed and clarity image, but it will sacrifice a bit in high ISO and the low light image. Same as smaller sensor with the same resolution as a big sensor, the image will suffer in high ISO or low light. Or there are 2 big sensors but different resolutions. For example, 18 megapixels versus 24 megapixel. Will there be any quality difference? For sure, the 18 megapixel will have better details and a large ratio. That's also why, for certain jobs demand, you will ask for a bigger format with more resolution. But the same principle again, the 24 megapixel sensor will have a better performance in low light or high ISO. Then we come to the depth of field. Regarding the control of depth of field, especially the shallow depth of field, there are mainly 4 factors. The size of the sensor, the distance ratio between your subject to the camera and to the background, focal length, and finally the aperture. I will have another talk on this issue of matters. Regarding the above 4 factors, the most crucial one is the size of the sensor. Without question again, the larger format will be easier for achieving an effect of shallow depth of field. Of course, I will say that not all the time the picture effect with a shallow depth of field will be the best, and a smaller format can also achieve shallow depth of field effects. But with a similar position and equipment, a larger sensor gets an advantage and produce a shallow depth of field effect. And again, since the shallow depth of field could help to create a better three-dimensional feeling, and that eventually affect your judging on image quality, larger format indeed get an advantage over smaller format. The above conditions are mainly for still photography. How about for movies then? Or you may say that if I can shoot beautiful photos with the above conditions, then the movies could also be good. Yes, but not totally right or wrong. Firstly, the resolution request for movies is still not that high at this moment. Both the cinema or main broadcast system request for around 2K of resolution only. Netflix will request 4K for its own production, but 4K shootings is mainly for better image compression to 1080p. That's why most of the standard motion picture camera gets only 4K resolution, while the excess resolution of a hybrid camera will just take a further burden when processing the data. I have mentioned before in the episode of GH5S, a good image from an excess resolution has to apply the oversampling image method, which will make a camera easily overheated. Secondly, there is the Jello Effect from the rolling shutter. Since the readout time from a full-frame sensor is much slower than a smaller sensor, the Jello Effect from a big sensor is always worse than a small sensor. Finally, there is also a very crucial factor that I love the shadow depth of field, so I prefer large format as well. And that's also why when the Canon 5D Mark II came into the market, people were so amazing with its shallow depth of field, especially good for indie film or microfilms. Nevertheless, you may notice that those microfilms may not involve many action images and relatively quite static. By the way, the depth of field of Hollywood or mainstream movies is not so shallow indeed. It is because there is actually a certain difference requirement for photos or movies. Since photos have freezed any movement, so we need to establish certain three-dimensional feelings to outstanding the subject. But on the contrary, a subject could be easily identified in motion pictures. So, a shallow depth of field is not a must in many situations. That's again also why the 35mm format is well accepted and in love for movie makings in the past many years. So a smaller format such as APS-C or the M4 is indeed not bad for movie making, especially M4. This format is very suitable for documentary, small crew, or even one-man band production. A comparatively longer depth of field could be easier for operation, especially you are using manual lenses. Let's have a brief conclusion. I will say that a bigger format, of course, gets certain advantages, especially for detail, carity, and shadow depth of field. But for movies, especially if you want a comparatively easy operation, small format could be a good option. And I will say that again, if you want to have some eye-catching photos easily, you should go for a bigger format, like full frame or even medium format. Or you can take the APS-C format as an in-between option. But finally, I will say that you can make good images from any of the existing formats once if you really get the skill and innovative creativity.